I recently had a conversation, or overheard a conversation rather, with one of my very recent bosses who was giving some sage advice to some subalterns. And the advice was, look, I always look forward to giving presentations because you're always the one that knows the most in the room. And then I saw the list of who I was speaking after today and looked through the audience, and I realised that, sir, you're wrong. I'm most certainly not the most educated on this topic. However, it is a privilege to be here. And my topic of discussion today is the advent of tank, one which I'm very happy to speak about, but more so because I think it contributes to the combined arms discussion that's already been had, and the fact that, and I want to reiterate, that tanks never fight alone, and that goes for everything that we do now in Army as well. So with that and the advent of tanks, it progressed and was invented as a concept to break the stalemate of the defensive trench warfare on the Western Front. And the first tank saw combat during the Somme at the Battle of Fleur de Courcelette. Its impact, however, was not decisive. Reliability issues, crew training and inexperience, and of course a lack of understanding of the tactics of the vessel all drove it to have very limited impact on that first battle. However, there was hope. There was hope in this new technology, as some witness accounts saw some Germans fleeing machine gun nests at the sight of this moving metal beast, and thereby encouraging those that had invested the time into this technology. Of course, after a series of additional other limited successes, or in other words failures, including Passchendaele and others, JFC Fuller argued for his case on massing on the Hindenburg and of course at Cambrai. The United Kingdom, France and to a lesser extent Germany progressed with the tank concept during the war years. However, its potential was not really realised during this time, and it wasn't until later, and the continued investment in the technology and also in the tactics of how to utilise them as part of the Combined Arms team was now realised for the potential they have. Now, noting that, where did they come from? Well, the first armoured cars were already in service in the lead up to the war. However, after those years of fighting, and of course with the trenches and in the way they were being used at the time, their utility was somewhat futile. Thereby, necessity became the mother of invention. Requirements were therefore laid out, and that being they needed to traverse difficult or rough terrain, cross trenches with a stipulated gap crossing of at least 8 feet, get across shell holes, barbed wire, but more importantly and most importantly, reduce the heavy loss of infantry life. And thereby the Landship Committee was formed in February 1915. Now, an interesting name, but it was put in with this Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton. Now, he was an important fellow because he had previously suggested putting armour plating onto an American Holt, which was an artillery tractor. And he thought that this would be a good way to traverse the terrain and do some of the things we've already mentioned as a requirement. To go into his team, there was a collective purse from the military engineers, some other officers, but importantly, the Royal Navy Air Service. Now, they were an important inclusion because they already had experience with armour plating on the airfield security vehicles, but also you can see the linkage to the Landship Committee name itself. Thomas Hetherington was a man that was inside there, and he came up with a concept for the land battleship. Now, his concept didn't necessarily progress too far. He came up with a concept for a 30-metre armoured vehicle, manned with 3 twin-gunned turrets, and of course it didn't go anywhere. However, the first tank was born out of that Landship Committee, Mark I, colloquially known as Big Willie, or otherwise known as Mother, as the mother of tanks. Now, Mother trialled in January 1916, approximately 1 month after the prototype of Little Willie. She was underpowered, could travel at a maximum speed in good conditions of 5 kilometres per hour, but was capable of getting across that 9-foot trench. That was very important. She was thereby seen as that slow and unstoppable juggernaut. She came in 2 variants, male and a female. The male had a 6-pounder gun and the female had a heavy Vickers machine gun. But while it's important that we recognise the Landship Committee, and probably one for a little bit of Australian folk history, is that it'd be remiss not to mention this gentleman here being Lancelot de Mol. So he claimedly designed and built a model, which you can see there from an Australian War Memorial photograph, and subsequently provided his designs to the British War Office in 1912, and again with some improvements in 1915 of that vehicle that you can see there. Now hopefully you can see the similarities without giving you too much eye strain. Now, a Royal Commission on Awards to Invention sat in November 1919. De Mol decided to attend in person and put his case forward as to being the inventor of said tank. However, all of his claims were rejected, thereby receiving no financial compensation, unlike others that were in the Landship Committee. He was, however, given dispatches, and I'll just read this. We consider, this is from the Royal Commission, we consider he's entitled to the greatest credit of having made and reduced to practical shape, as far back as 1912, a very brilliant invention, which anticipated and in some respects surpassed that actually put into use in the year 1916. Now I note he is an Australian. The newspaper clipping that you see there is 19th May 1941, printed from the Townsville Bulletin. So as mentioned back at the Battle of Flers and its subsequent limited successes through to its first use at Cambrai, there was a couple of things that need to be improved and or addressed. Firstly, the armour was penetrable. Terrain where it was being used at the time limited its success due to it either being bogged or being ditched, which occurs when the tracks no longer move because your belly plate is sitting on the ground. And similarly, it had a problem of catching on fire quite easily when in contact. The reason being is the fuel cell was on the top of the vehicle at the rear, and thereby assisting gravity feed to the engine of the fuel, but of course not very good for protection. And I think the last improvement that really never was addressed and directly applies to that one was there was no escape hatch. Some of these were fixed and or mitigated. One of those being the armour being impenetrable, was you could add more armour, but that of course, as you know, add extra weight to a vehicle with an engine. It will slow it down even further, decrease mobility and the like. So they issued them a leather helmet with a bit of a chain face guard to help assist in the limiting of injury from the resulting spall that used to fly around the vehicle if it was penetrated. Of course, the vehicle was already exceedingly hot, the engine was inside, the gears were all inside, the consequences of fire and the cordite made it very uncomfortable anyway, and the chain was hard to see through. And on top of that, if your vehicle did get immobilised and try to get out, the leather helmets looked a lot like the enemy, so your life expectancy wasn't good either way. But in saying that, what you do see in that photo there is one attempt to address a problem which was the ditching. This is an anti-ditching beam. It used to be stored on those rails that you can see on the top there. In the event that you did get bogged down or your belly plate armour, your belly plate got stuck on the soil, hitch those chains up, the tracks would pull the beam around, lifting the plate up and hopefully getting you out of it. But that was also the first concept of how you might also put things on the roof and transport it around, and was later seen in the use of brushwood for seams to put into trenches and other things later, especially at Cambrai. So this is, again, mother being the invention and necessity quote that we said before. Here's another one. I also want to highlight now, before I quickly move on from the Mark I and subsequent issues, that the first self-propelled gun came off this platform as well, which was a Mark I. It was adapted and designed to carry a 152mm howitzer. It was winched onto an open platform at the front of the vehicle. 48 of that vehicle variant was made and was sent to France in June 1917. Of course, other countries did develop and progress with the tank concept. This being the French Renault FT17. Understanding the British and what the British had achieved with their vehicles and experimenting with their own artillery tractor-based tanks, in 1917 they decided to explore an extremely new design, and this is the one you can see. It's light, only 6.5 tonne. It has 2 men in it, travels at speeds of over 10 kilometres per hour with greater range, and offered a differing concept for the use of armoured fighting vehicles, and in this case tanks, for people to explore tactics, techniques and procedures on. Of course, this was a highly successful tank also because of its revolving turret, the first of its kind also, which brought out differing ways in how to utilise the vehicle in combat and reconnaissance roles. It first saw combat in May 18 and served in every other battle the French participated in from that date. Over 3,000 were produced by the French during the war alone, and it stayed in service with the French until 1940. They exported that vehicle to other countries, who then used it and influenced tank design all through the future, and you can see the resembling natures that we see. Now, I did mention Germany had limited experimentation with the tank, this being this one in front of you. Again, they did have their own concepts in the pre-war area, but like other countries, ditched them as being too hard and not where their armies needed to go into a fight. What they soon learnt when the tanks first came on at Fleurs, they decided, through their High Commission, to actually reinvigorate some plans to get into armoured vehicle development, and this was the result. This is there was one other vehicle they tried to explore prior, which was the armoured land cruiser. Now, I only mention this very quickly because it was massive. They tried to experiment with a 550-tonne tank, and that really, truly did not move. They then went on to a trucked haulage truck, which was tracked in itself, again failed, and then reverted to, and I find this interesting, the American tractors as their basis for their tank development. Now, they were able to get access to those through the Hungary built tanks under licence from America. This vehicle here is the Alpha 7 Victor, or the Sturmpanzerwagen, not quite as good as the other one, but it had a 57mm gun, 6 machine guns, weighed 37 tonne, and unfortunately for them and the crew inside, there was 18 men manning it. It came in at around the end of 17, had some success in what it did, however very limited, and like I said, didn't truly influence the result as we moved forward. So moving on to Cambrai. In this case here, there was about 376 Mark IV tanks, and what was different about the utility of the tank and why people still use Cambrai as a field of study for tank is it was used in mass. The number that you see there is completely different to the numbers that were described previously, and also in the way that they tried to use it. It came out of the rugged, swamp-like in some area terrain that had previously been seen, and now into a slightly more open terrain where the size of the force could be utilised in conjunction with other arms and supported ably by the artillery. They were able to cross the terrain. I'm glad that it was brought out that there was no preparatory fires because, as evidenced in previous battles where tank was first put to use, the preparatory fires actually dug up a lot of the terrain they tried to drive across, and a lot of the tanks stayed exactly in the hole that they fell in. Surprise was an asset, or an attempted tactic that they used at Cambrai with the tank, and that being moving the tanks into their assembly areas and or FUPs by night and at low engine revs. Now, if you imagine that 5 kilometres an hour was at full capacity, this was a slow and deliberate plan to manoeuvre these vehicles with low engine revs. Similarly, they did create dummy tanks. Now, I love hearing that every year we do a Hamel or a Talisman saver. The dummy tanks is going to be the one thing of deception that's going to save the world. I'm glad it still works, but it was way back in Cambrai as well. I do want to touch quickly on breaching. Breaching is the tactics and the tools, is I think the lessons that we're going to get out, especially with tank. And that being, I truly believe this is one of the first instances where SOSRA, being suppression, obscuration, secure, obscure, suppress, reduce and assault, came into it. In this case here, it was a planned operation in concert, like I said, with the other arms, particularly with the artillery, where they knew exactly and had rehearsed what they needed to achieve. In this case here, the trenches is what they were after. So with a few of the tanks with grapnels fitted, others with the brushwood for seams on the top, came up in deliberate formations, like I said, en masse, to tackle the trenches as a problem. Now in this case, the first tank in formation of Arrowhead across the board, so multiplied over, would move forward and use itself as the wire cutter tank, if it had not already been neutralised by the 106 fuses. It would move forward, get through the wire, get up towards the trench, then go flank on, so its sponson gun could effect suppression in itself as well, enabling also a clear route for the second tank to move through, being the Fascine tank. It would move through, drop the brushwood in, then drive over the trench that had just dropped its Fascine in, move up to the second tank and do the same thing, flank on, sponson gun firing, and repeat until that trench complex had been breached. Now at this time here, that's when the infantry were also hot on the heels, not there for the initial part, but moving forward as an orchestrated event. And that's why I truly believe that the breach in this case here was one also to look at. There were, of course, lessons that came out of it, and the Combined Arms Cooperation I've just mentioned is one of those, but I've mentioned here the manoeuvre warfare piece as well. I'd like to highlight that the use of the heavy tank for what the heavy tank could do at the time was successful. But we've also heard that the hot battle overall was that seesaw and ultimately almost the stalemate start back where we came. Thereby looking at who were the follow-on forces to exploit the success and who was ensuring that if you were going to put a lighter vehicle and or cavalry through, who had the guns to support that movement, the range of the guns, and what was the plan to support those assets. So this is where the lessons learned also came out of it. In this case, the British exploited some of those in other vehicle designs, being that of the Whippet, another highly successful little cavalry vehicle. But to really conclude now, and that is to look at where we are and moving forward, some of the things that we learnt from vehicle design and also the Battle of Cambrai is that we never fight alone. And I'll just keep saying it. As we move in a combined arms team, and that being the unit of action of Army as the combat brigade, the brigade is enabled also with other enablers that are inserted to fight as a team. And that's exactly what we need to see, and as we do. The armoured cavalry regiments are currently being structured as a 2 cavalry squadron, single tank entity that will support the brigade as the unit of action in whatever it needs with its mechanised infantry, its motorised infantry, its artillery, its engineers and combat service support enablers. As we move forward, we look at the dilemma of vehicle and technology design, being protection, mobility and firepower. You start thinking of weight, tracked wheeled, sustainment issue arguments, how many do you need, the refresh line, how do you sustain the capability if you're losing it on a force gen cycle, but all these are opportunities. So while they might seem as a challenge, this becomes the opportunity that we can keep progressing Army forward by looking at our past to understand where we can move forward to. I think that as we look at this, I'll just leave us with almost a staff college-like question, which is based on that nature and character of war. And as we know that the notions and the attempt of every nation is that we achieve that technological advantage over our adversary, we need to also look at how we move forward with our doctrine and how we use our doctrinal and technological advances and advantages to win. And while others would argue that both the nature and character continue to change, I would argue to look back into our history and to see that that was always the aim of our forebearers and those even of our enemies, was to gain that advantage in whatever way possible, be it technological or doctrinal, and thereby maybe presenting an argument for it being a constant. And if that is the case, then we as planners can also continue to move forward in that space. And that being, we've always had strengths regardless of the technology that we bring, but they will always have their weaknesses. And then at the lowest level, the combined arms teams that we've already heard about is the way that we try to mitigate them. But then as we move forward, and then at the high level, the planning and the orchestration of the other effects is what we're trying to bring to bear, and that is to weaken the defences of our enemy, our adversary, and thereby impact on their decision cycles. Thank you.